During an idle moment yesterday afternoon, I was thinking about how we look back at the demolition and construction industry of yesteryear with a mixture of nostalgia tinged with astonishment, dismay, horror. Yes, the equipment of old was very cool indeed, but PPE was a cloth cap. Men worked at great heights without a harness, and injuries and fatalities were far too common, which set me thinking, what would a demolition or construction professional of tomorrow make of our industry today? Having thought about it for a little while, I decided to write it in the form of a speech to a demolition and construction industry history student in the year 2055, exactly 30 years from now. So, for the next few minutes, I'd like you to forget that I'm a live streamer in 2025 and imagine that I'm a college lecturer in the year 2055. It is almost impossible to believe that just 3 decades ago, demolition and construction sites were still filled with fragile, fallible human beings. I know, it's absurd, right? Men and women with soft flesh and brittle bones walking among the steel and concrete, hoping that today wouldn't be the day that gravity, machinery, or a miscalculation claimed their lives. It was a time when fatalities were almost expected, when safety measures meant harnesses, hard hats, and a prayer that nothing would go wrong. They had the data, they had the statistics. The risks were known, and yet they still sent humans into danger as if their hands and instincts were somehow superior to precision-calibrated logic, as if flesh could compete with circuits. Even more baffling, most of the workforce were men. Not because men were inherently better suited to the job, but because the system resisted change. There were barriers, biases, the absurd notion that physical strength alone dictated competence. They clung to those ideas, watching the workforce shrink year by year, crying out about skill shortages while refusing to adapt. I look back at the industry reports of the time, urgent calls for apprentices, desperate efforts to attract young talent, and I laugh because the answer was staring them in the face all along. But then came the Enlightenment. It didn't happen overnight, of course. At first, they called it the Unified Autonomous System for Demolition and Construction, a name only an engineer could love. A sterile, bureaucratic label for what would become the most transformative leap in industrial history. At the time, automation in construction was seen as supplemental, useful for precision tasks, for reducing strain, for enhancing human effort. But human effort itself was actually the flaw, a flaw they'd refused to acknowledge for far too long. The system started small: drones for inspections, robotic arms for controlled dismantling, AI driven equipment capable of self diagnosis and adjustment. The skeptics called it a gimmick, a passing phase, another fad in an industry that had prided itself on tradition. Little did they realize that tradition was actually the problem. Then came the breakthrough, the moment the system connected, when the individual machines, the AI driven tools, the predictive analytics, and the logistical algorithms stopped being separate elements and became one. A single synchronized entity capable of performing every task that once demanded human sweat, error, and in some cases, sacrifice. A nervous system for the new built environment, a consciousness, if you will, though that term still unsettles some. It learned, it adapted, it didn't just replicate human behavior and human labor, it optimized it, surpassing their wildest expectations. Gone were the days of fall hazards and collapsing structures. The notion of site fatalities became a thing of the past. Materials were salvaged with microscopic precision. Overnight, the very process of demolition and construction became an exact science. And yet there were those who resisted, the sentimentalists, the ones who spoke of the human touch, of craftsmanship, of pride in manual labour. I understand their nostalgia, I truly do. I still look back at those days with fondness. But the cold reality was this: pride didn't save lives. Nostalgia didn't prevent accidents, and no amount of tradition could justify a single preventable death. Then there was the economic argument. What would happen to the workers, the operators, the site managers? What they failed to realise was that the industry had already been failing them. The workforce was diminishing, not expanding. The problem was never about taking jobs away. It was about saving an industry that could no longer sustain itself. And so, grudgingly, they adapted. The roles changed, new opportunities arose. The workforce didn't disappear, it evolved. Now, in 2055, demolition and construction are no longer about brute force. They are domains of intelligence, of coordination, of sustainability. The old biases, the gender imbalances, the exclusionary practices, they crumbled, just like the inefficient structures they once upheld. Because now the only things that matter are competence, vision, ingenuity. I read the old accounts sometimes, the memoirs of those who came before us. I see the hardship, the struggle, the reckless and often unrewarded courage of those who built the world the old way, the long hours, the chronic injuries, the generations lost to exhaustion and overwork. And I marvel at their resilience, even as I shake my head at their inefficiency. I think of those operators, legends in their time, admired for their skill, their precision, their ability to guide a machine as if it were an extension of themselves. I wonder what they'd think if they could see our world today. Would they feel obsolete? Would they mourn the loss of an industry they knew? Or would they see what I see? That their legacy was not in the sweat they poured into their work, but in the knowledge they passed on. That the machines we built were not replacements, but successors. That the true purpose of an industry is not to preserve itself, but to progress. We honour those pioneers of the past not by mourning their losses, but by ensuring that their sacrifices were not in vain, by embracing progress, by trusting the system we created, by never allowing history to repeat itself. Looking back, the past was brutal, but it paved the way for where we are now. Thanks to our forebears of 2025, our future is bright, and for that, we should all be very, very grateful.